All right. Welcome officially to the third webinar in our series on cyber defense strategies with IT Masters and Charles University. We are going to be joined in a moment by the wonderful Dr. George Thomas, who many of you may be familiar with from the previous 2 weeks. Before we get officially started with the content, I would just like to acknowledge that we are coming to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and pay our respects to their elders and ancestors, and ongoing sovereignty and connection to lands, waters, and culture. This third session is presented, as I said, by Dr. George Thomas. We do have a survey this week as well for you to fill out, which the wonderful Kit, who is doing back-end assistance with us this week, will be popping in the chat. And just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started, as usual. If you've got a comment that you would like to share with all participants, as well as the host and panelists, you can pop that in the chat section down the bottom, slightly to the left on your Zoom window. And if you've got a question directly about the course content for George, you can direct that to the Q&A section, which is slightly to the right on the bottom panel of your Zoom. And so if we can just keep those comments or things that you'd like to share with other participants to the chat section, and questions about the actual course content to the Q&A section, that would be fantastic. I think that's all from me right now. My name's Jack Stewart, and I'll hand over to Dr. George.
Thanks, thanks, Jack, and welcome back to week 3. And so for folks that probably recall last week, we kind of abruptly came to an end there due to some time constraints, I think, mostly. So we're going to sort of carry on from there, but I'll do the sort of spiel on kind of what we will cover tonight with, yes, a slight amendment, which then will kind of lead into some of those more technical controls that we will cover off today. And so week 3, module 3, another continuation on administrative and technical controls, with an emphasis this week on more of the technical stuff. So as I had just mentioned, we began with a short case study last week, so we'll just sort of wrap that up. But then what we'll do is we'll start moving into more of the technical pieces. So looking at access controls, looking at what access controls are, what sort of elements make up access controls, and then moving on to sort of network security and what that looks like, and a bit of a look at some of the traditional network security, models, to some of the more modern ones, going down into system hardening, which I know we touched on last week, so we'll probably blow through that one pretty quickly, and then going down into endpoint protection, and then data protection, and then we'll probably wrap up there. So for the sort of benefit of anyone that, including me, who doesn't quite remember everything about the short case study last week, bit of a recap. So, this is a very short and sort of basic example of a case study, but really kind of goes to thinking about where to sort of tackle this type of situation. You can't really build a cyber strategy in, an hour or an hour and a half. But there are sort of key things that will, I guess, help guide, where to start really, because that often I think is a bit of a challenge, is like, where do I start? And organizations have different levels of maturity. They have different budgets, they have different resources. So yeah, there's a lot of, I guess, variables in this, but, in the broad sense, I mean, I personally will apply the same sort of logic and thinking and sort of standards and frameworks to to any sort of, I guess, strategy that I'm building out. And yeah, here there's some clues in here as to what to look out for. And so I don't know if I need to kind of, well, I'll sort of summarize this again. So we've got the global CISO at a bank. The bank is based in Australia. It has, it's primarily based in Australia, but they do have some overseas sort of presence. I think we probably established that there's probably some obligations through things like APRA, through the Privacy Act, obviously. There's going to be potentially some GDPR considerations. There's also going to be some NYDFS, so New York Department of Financial Services considerations. But sort of, and that's, you know, obviously very useful from a compliance perspective and in making sure that those obligations are met. But then kind of going down to what, you know, what the board are concerned about. You know, they've asked for a cyber defense plan to help protect the bank and customers. And then there's some strategic objectives that have been called out here. So things like high levels of customer trust, to be considered a trusted partner by business customers, and to grow the bank both domestically and in overseas markets, where I think is where it's important to also consider some of those regulatory and legislative obligations. There is some sort of broad statements around risk. And, you know, ensuring that there's a limited chance of adverse events that affect customers, and there's a low tolerance for risk, and that it's in a regulated industry, which is sort of called out. And then there's the what should we do next? So I think last week there was a bit of an empty risk register. So, you know, while we're waiting, mind you, this is very simple and very short. But what it sort of does is starts to break down some of that thinking. And so, you know, based on the sort of strategic direction that that the bank has in the case study, based on some of the concerns that the board has, based on some of the sort of legal and regulatory considerations, and obviously the current threat climate, I've populated about 5 very high level risks here. And I typically, as I think many risk professionals will do, is take a very high level approach to identifying risk. Otherwise, your risk register will become huge if you start to go very, very granular. But I think it's fair to say that, you know, up here, and the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is in no particular order, and I'll get into that in a second, but, you know, 1 is the one that came to mind first, was around data breaches. So data breaches could result in reputational and operational impact, as well as regulatory penalties. So the sort of what is the risk, and what could happen, what is the consequence of the risk, is described in that statement. Now, this is a bit of a qualitative view. You probably recall we covered that off in week 1, where the likelihood is possible. And this is taking into consideration, you know, the current controls that are in place, and the impact, if it were to happen, would be severe because, you know, going back to regulatory penalties, you know, distrust of customers and reputational impact and things like that. So as a result, and if you remember the matrix back in week 1, there was that sort of almost like a heat map. And so when we look at that likelihood up the one axis, and then we look at the impact the other way, it places that rating into an extreme, which means that, you know, and given the tolerance for risk at the organization based on the risk statements, something needs to be done about it. You know, there's a bit of a gap assessment that's happened here. And as I said, I think a lot of this happens kind of behind the scenes. But, you know, let's say that it was assessed that the controls were unsatisfactory, and there needs to be some treatment plans. And so with treatment plans, once again, these are high level, and these will break down into more detailed things where we look at things like access control around network security, data protection, all that sort of stuff. But, you know, secure information systems appropriately based on the sensitivity of data. So even just from that, like in my mind, I'm sort of starting to think about access controls. As I said, I'm thinking about network security, and I am thinking about data protection. I'm thinking about sensitivity of data. So classification, labeling, protection, encryption, DLP, all those sorts of things. So this is kind of where I'm sort of stepping through what these risks are. I'm doing an assessment on, you know, based on, and a lot of this is based on experience, but also if you've got solid data to back these things up, like to back up risk and to back up the decisions that you make. I mean, that's obviously going to be a great benefit, especially when it comes to, and we'll talk about this next week, you know, getting budgeting and resourcing and, you know, I guess, adoption from the board. Sorry, I feel like someone said they can't see it. Hope that helps. And once again, so this is just a format. I mean, there's no real, I guess, right or wrong specific format for risk. I mean, there are some sort of guides around sort of standards, like for example, there's a NIST standard and there's an ISO standard around risk that we talked about. But it's really about what's useful to your organization. Obviously, you want to capture the risk, you want to capture the likelihood and impact. You want to have an owner. You need to assign that to somebody so that somebody is responsible for it. Some organizations might capture other sort of pieces of information, like what is the risk if we had no controls versus what is it where we currently are at. Potentially, what is the residual risk? So there's quite a lot of sort of considerations around what might be in here. As I said, this is a fairly basic one. I mean, this would probably do for many organizations, but some, want more, want more detailed information. I just saw something pop up in the chat. And sorry, I'm not really reading the chat, but I see it sort of skim by, and someone just put a Q in there for me, which is the CIA thing on the right. So yeah, that's nothing to do with a government agency. That goes back to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And if anyone is going through ISO certification, some external auditors want to see that you're tying your risk to one of those three principles of information security. So does that risk impact confidentiality? Does it impact integrity? Does it impact availability? Does it impact two of them, three of them? Because it will generally do that. And so you can see like the third one there talks about unavailability of client-facing systems, e.g. website, mobile banking. You could imagine if you're a customer, you'd be pretty mad probably if you wanted to go and do some internet banking and it didn't work. And so there's some controls there, that would prevent DDoS and things like that, but there is still risk, and that would potentially affect the availability of those systems. One that would probably make you even madder is the one about integrity. So if your account information is wrong, that would probably make you pretty upset. If you thought you had money and suddenly you didn't, maybe if it went the other way, you'd be less upset, but obviously it doesn't quite work that way. So yeah, just capturing that is the sort of starting point. And so if I continue, I'm going to sort of nut down into the approach. I'm conscious we still have quite a lot of content to get through tonight, so I am talking fast. But selecting an approach. Now, standards and frameworks approach, I like to start here because it avoids having to reinvent the wheel. Having said that, many organizations will already have probably something in place, or they will aspire to have something. And so usually it's not too hard to kind of, forklift in this type of approach. So taking a standards or a frameworks approach, so whether it be ISO 27001, not saying that, an organization has to go and get certified. You could still take that standard and apply it to an organization. You don't have to go and pay to get the auditing and the certificate and all that sort of stuff, but, obviously benefits to doing that. Otherwise, there are other options like, NIST. And so, as I mentioned previously, there's the NIST cybersecurity framework, or there's the NIST special publication 853, which is very similar to ISO. It has that sort of, risk assessment, that controls approach, and the sort of governance aspects to it. The next thing would obviously be to get senior leadership buy-in, because you need buy-in from, executives and senior leadership to help implement a lot of those things, and make sure that the organization is adopting any sort of changes and is funding any projects that you need to do, all that sort of stuff. And then there's the whole piece around setting up the program, and so that's obviously what we've already sort of talked about is part of the program, but then there's also things around objectives. So what is the objective of the program? How are you going to measure that? How are you going to report it? There's also going to be pieces, etc. But there's going to be pieces around, compliance, and obviously there's the risk assessment piece that we just talked about. So once that's set up, and as I said, you could follow something like ISO and NIST to avoid having to do everything from scratch. And the next thing would be to do that risk assessment, which I kind of already did, and then start looking at treatment controls. And so, what I had in that risk register, which, sorry, I'll see if I could just bring it back up again, wherever it went. I don't know what's happened to my, yeah, there it is. I had some high level treatment. So these are more treatment plans. So they're very, like the risk statements, they're very high level. They sort of say, we will do this, but there's no sort of prescriptive, sort of description around controls. Sorry, that was just for the purpose of showing those high level plans. But the next thing would be to look at the individual controls, select those controls, which we are going to talk about in a minute, and then implement the treatment controls. So as I said, in the sort of situation, or the requirements for Ashley back here, it was likely to be stuff, depending on these risks, and I should just keep that risk register up there because it's probably easier. If I had a high level, once again, it's not quite that simple. There's a lot more that goes into it. But if I looked at data breach, as I said, I would start looking at things like, access controls. I would look at things like, SIEM and XDR, and I would look at things like security awareness campaigns. There'd be all sorts of bits and pieces that I would start to think about as controls. Then, we talk about things like contractual obligations. I mean, the first thing is going to be to go through agreements and look at those obligations, work out what controls those obligations may need and what the risks are, and then build that out. Unavailability of, a website because of, potentially DDoS, which looks like it's already mitigated, but if it's vulnerabilities, maybe it's something like secure development lifecycle, like vulnerability management of secure coding, vulnerability management and secure coding, and it's things like that. I mean, we'll talk about some of that stuff in a minute. And yeah, things like, loss of equipment outside the office. I mean, that might be disk encryption. It's probably going to be access controls again. It might be device management, so you could track and wipe devices and things like that. So it's quite a lot of bits and pieces to that. Right, let's get on to controls. Does anyone have any questions on it? I should pause because that was sort of a continuation of last week. So I'm going to pause for a moment. And if anyone's got, okay, there are questions.
There are a couple of questions. I might let you choose which ones you would like to answer tonight, George, if you feel up to that in the Q&A section.
Yeah. I'll answer the first one there. So where on the approach slide would you have the gap analysis? So let's go back. Okay. So you've conducted your risk assessment and selected treatment controls. So it depends what your gap analysis is intended to do. If it's intended to look at the gaps of the security program more broadly from a governance perspective, then you'd probably do that quite early in. So for example, say you've decided that you're going to go down the ISO route, you would probably do a gap analysis at that point to see what you actually have that meets that requirement, and what you need to do. For example, you're probably going to find out very early that you don't have a statement of applicability because if you haven't implemented it already, then you probably don't have that. If you are talking about the treatment controls, so this is where you're doing the more technical, not necessarily technical, because there is things like cybersecurity awareness training that would need to happen. There are things around identifying legislative, contractual, and regulatory obligations, but you would do that after you've sort of built out your treatment plan. So what controls are you going to implement to identify to treat those risks that you've identified? So you would probably do a gap assessment there. So there's probably two places that you would do it. One would be a more broad security program gap assessment, and the second one would be more of a controls based gap assessment. That's how I would tackle that. So what exactly is meant by getting senior leadership buy-in? So look, that's a good question, and we're going to talk a little bit about that next week. But in terms of how I explain that is senior leadership ultimately are accountable for the organization. So they're going to be board members, executives. So when I talk about senior, I'm talking like top management, right? And so at the end of the day, that group is typically going to be the group that will have a couple of roles, but one is going to be obviously accountability, as I just mentioned. The other one is going to be around providing funding and resourcing to implement a security program and to be building out your and to be implementing controls and things like that. So they're basically going to be kind of supplying the money, so to speak. So that's another reason why you need to have senior leadership buy-in. The other one is around getting things done. And so when you think about implementing any security program or cyber defense strategy, a key element is typically change management, because you're going to be implementing things, you're going to be changing things. So for example, if you implement data leakage prevention or data loss prevention, someone's going to notice, right? If you're going to be implementing a cybersecurity awareness program, people have to do it. If you're going to be putting in multi-factor authentication, hopefully everyone already has that, but there is a user impact, and you'll often find that that's probably going to be met with resistance. There's going to be well, this is really annoying. And trust me, I mean, I've had so many, this is going to be really annoying situations. And look, I'll be honest, there'll be times when I've gotten it wrong. And it's not that I've gotten it like wrong, but it sort of impeded usability for some reason. And sometimes, often it was just kind of, I'm not trying to downplay it, but sometimes I was kind of like, really? As an example, and I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, I implemented a baseline standard, baseline benchmark from CIS on 1,600 endpoints, and they were like touchscreens. And for some reason, it made like a button not work. Now, obviously, that's probably a bit of a testing problem, but I guess that put a bit of a what's the word? Sour taste might be the right word, actually, where people are like, oh, let's just roll it back. But you really need sort of senior management to be almost championing the sort of implementation of that and supporting it. And there's always that kind of lead by example piece as well. So if you can articulate the risk and the reasoning as to why you're doing it, and as I said, a lot of that is around risk and saying, okay, well, I can, and which is where quantitative risk is really beneficial. But if you can get that point across and you can get that leadership buy-in, it makes it a lot easier to implement to the organization. That's what I found. Which is, I think I said, maybe it was a different conversation. Sorry, I have a lot of these conversations where I said, often what I've seen, especially previously, not so much now, but security used to, in most places, I'm going to say, used to almost be siloed into technology. And so it was more of a technology problem rather than a business problem. And don't get me wrong, there's obviously a big technology piece in this, but having it siloed like that usually means it's a bit too far removed from senior leadership, as in, CEO, CFO, board, and it's probably not getting as much attention as it should. I think with all the, breaches and the changes in climate that have happened over the past couple of years, that's definitely shifted. So, yeah. All right, so I talked a lot about that question. I'm going to not answer that one about the controls after implementation, because we are going to talk about measurement next week. So yeah, that's something that we're going to cover next week. How do we measure ROI? How do we demonstrate, what we've done and that it's effective? So who is responsible and accountable for the cybersecurity program in the organization, CISO or management or board? It depends on the organization. So typically, ultimately the board is accountable ultimately, because that's as sort of as far up as it goes, but they would potentially delegate some of that responsibility to somebody else. So they might delegate that to a CISO, to an information security manager, to even another, like even another C-level executive. So yeah, it depends on the organization. But yeah, that at the end of the day, the board will always be accountable. So, I mean, there's only one question left up there, which is the one around auditing a contract manager, federal government agency. how detailed would you expect the contract manager to be across IC pertaining to the third-party industries that agency may have outsourced the function to? That's a very long and possibly detailed question. Do you mind if we pop that one into the discussion forum? I think that might require a little bit more thought before I answer that.
Absolutely do that. Sorry, George, for not reading out these questions to you tonight. I'm actually quite sick and I have muted myself to sneeze. I'm so sorry.
No, all good. You do sound like a bit of a blocked nose. Definitely something going around. All right. Hope you feel better. So controls. Let's talk about controls. So access controls. By the way, again, not an exhaustive list of controls. Absolutely not. There are more, but let's talk about some of the main ones. And I realize as I kind of go through these that what I didn't talk about awareness training, which is obviously very, very important, probably one of the more important controls. But and I think we've talked about it a few times now. So just remember that one. Good, do that one too. So access control. Many definitions here. I don't know if anyone's seen the NIST one, but it's pretty like as many as things are. It's a bit weird. But anyway, so I like the Microsoft one. It's an essential element of security that determines who is allowed to access certain data, apps, and resources, and in what circumstances. And so one thing that I've seen, anyone that's been in any of my classes has probably seen this a few times, which is AAA, AAA, not the people that come and fix your car when you've got a flat tire. This is authentication, authorization, and accounting. I think there's potentially some other similar way to describe this, but at the end of the day, it's a standard sort of framework used to control who is permitted to use network resources through authentication. And then obviously there's some pieces around being able to monitor and capture events. So there's the identification and validation of the entity. So, when I say I want to log into this particular network system, I have to identify myself and I have to prove that somehow. So, that's usually, we'll get into MFA, but traditionally that would have been username and password. Okay, so username, George, password, something complicated. And then at that point, you pass that authentication step and you have been validated to be that entity. The next part is around authorization. So, what can the entity access? This is where we think about things like role-based access control, so RBAC. We think about group memberships. We think about, the permissions piece. So, what does George have access to? Does he have access to the finance folder? Does he not have access to the finance folder? Does he have access to the IT folder? Does he have administrative privileges? Can he reset passwords? Talking about things like delegated permissions and stuff like that. So, what can he do? What can I do? And when we say entity, that's not necessarily a person. It could be a service account. It could be anything, right? So it could be anything that is requesting access and that needs to then access something. And then finally, there's the accounting. So the monitoring and capturing of events. And so this becomes pretty important, and we'll talk about sort of logging a bit later. But I think at the end of the day, someone has asked for access to a resource, someone's asked for access to the network. They've been validated. They have then been, given permission to access something, and it'd be, there needs to be a sort of trail of that, just so that it can be sort of, reviewed if needed, if there's any sort of forensic requirements, which also we'll talk about shortly. So that's the sort of accounting piece of that. When we talk about authentication, sorry, I've clicked and nothing happened. So when we talk about authentication, I didn't realize I could put emojis in PowerPoint slides until today. So we talk about that. We talk about like, how do we strengthen authentication? As I said, the traditional username and password is a bit like meh. I put it here, only usernames and passwords. No, let's not do that. And there are some standards, right? So there's some standards that do provide some guidance on what makes a strong password. And around sort of digital identity. And so we've got the CIS benchmark password policy. For example, this would state or this states that you should have an 8-character minimum if you have multi-factor authentication enabled. If you do not, it should be 14 characters. And we'll get into strength in a minute. You've got NIST, which basically says a minimum of 8 characters. And then you've got the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, who basically say, ditch passwords, use passphrases. I tend to agree with them. So, I mean, I use passphrases. And, passphrases, they will say, should be at least 4 words and should be at least 14 characters in length. I would often also say, make sure that they don't make any sense. So, don't take a phrase from a book or anything like that. So, the less sense they make, the better. The other thing around, using passwords opposed to passphrases are things like complexity requirements. And so, things like having minimum and maximum password ages. So I should explain some of this stuff. So complex passwords, like if you talk to Microsoft, a complex password is 3 out of the 4 groups, right? So uppercase, lowercase, number, and special character. If you've got 3 out of those 4, then they say it's a complex password. I think the jury's a little bit out on that one because, what day is this today? Thursday 1 with a capital T, technically by that criteria would be considered a complex password. It would definitely satisfy it. By the way, don't set your password to that. I'm sure no one was going to, but that would be a complex password by that standard. But I guess it's better than nothing. There are other tools, third-party tools that will actually enforce hard passwords. So if they pick up that there's a password like that, it will actually prevent that from being set. Minimum password length is the amount of time before you could change the password again. And why is that useful? Because, sometimes folks like to think of creative ways to get around having to change their password. So let's say a password system says, well, we will remember the last 7 passwords. They just change it 8 times and they're back to the start. So by putting a minimum password age of, 1 or 2 days, then it's going to take them over a week to get there. And they probably will have gone, well, that was just annoying. So they won't do that. Maximum password length is your very well known, your password has expired. And then you've got other things like lockout, how many attempts before the password, before the account locks. And you've got lockout durations. Is it, days on end, or will unlock after 30 minutes, which can help slow down things like brute force attacks. But yeah, there's all those sorts of bits and pieces. And then you've got the whole multi-factor thing, right? So MFA, multi-factor authentication, sometimes called 2FA, two-factor authentication. And this is, based on that principle of something that you know, something that you have, and something that you are. Now, not where I currently am, but at some point in my career, I had an argument with somebody about, username, password, and PIN. And they said, well, no, we've got multi-factor. And I'm like, how? And they're like, well, you put in your username, you put in your password, and you put in your PIN. And I'm like, and so where do you get your PIN from? Oh, it's in your head. I'm like, okay, so that's 3 things that you know. So that's not multi-factor. That's just 3 things that you know. Whereas, if it's a mobile phone that generates a PIN, or a hardware token that generates a PIN, or it's a mobile phone that asks you to, approve a login, which, I was going to say, I used to be a bit, I am still wary of that one because people might accidentally press yes when they don't mean to, but I don't know if anyone's seen recently, Microsoft Authenticator now says, hey, put in the number that's on the screen. So there's actually that extra step, but having that sort of tangible piece of equipment like that smartphone or token or whatever is actually something that you have. So that's actually a second factor. And then there's something that you are, which, biometrics. So, eyeballs, voice, fingerprints, handprints. Did I say retina scans? I said eyeballs, no. So those sorts of things are something you are. So obviously something that you, and also difficult to lose. So yeah, but having 2 or more factors is actual MFA, which obviously strengthens authentication. I'll talk quickly about single sign-on. So, single sign-on is a great tool for, being able to have one password sort of policy that could be applied over, numerous systems. It also means that, you can integrate things like MFA and have that really good experience. It also means that password reuse is less of an issue, generally speaking. But obviously it means that if someone were to gain access to an to a single sign-on, I guess, account, they could theoretically access everything else that account has access to. So that's probably the biggest drawback. But overall, it does strengthen authentication. And then the last one is password managers. So use that to generate passwords, to securely store passwords and things like that. Because password reuse is a big issue, and then poor passwords are also a big issue. So password managers help to alleviate some of that. All right. And then I just have this little cartoon here, which I don't know if anyone's seen this. It's from XKCD. So I've got a Creative Commons license, so I can't sell it, but I can show you and share it. You can share it. This is very old. This is just something that was stuck in my head. This is actually when I probably started using passphrases. I feel like this has been around now for about sort of 10, 15 years. But, using that, and don't use correct horse battery staple. But, using those sort of 4 random words, and, it talks about, using passphrases and the difficulty around them. I'm sure that these numbers are actually wrong now. 2 to the power of 44 or 550 years, because compute power will have increased since this cartoon was created, over a decade ago. But yeah, so I just found this interesting. I thought I'd just share it. All right, network security. So network zones, firewalls. So network zones, you've probably heard about network zones. A lot of the time when we hear about certain breaches, we heard about that defense contractor one. I think it was found that they had a flat network. In other words, they had no zoning. They just basically had, one IP range. They had no firewalling, no segmentation between the networks. Obviously very bad. And we will talk about zero trust. We will talk about zero trust shortly. Well, it's there, but there's another slide. And so network zoning is where you separate your networks into different sort of segments. So you have like a DMZ, which is where you'll have your demilitarized zone, where you have your sort of untrusted, sort of less trusted, almost internet facing systems. Then you'll have usually a sort of client network, where, when I say client, as in where you probably have the majority of, and by the way, we talk about traditional networks at the moment, not zero trust. You have your sort of traditional infrastructure sort of sit in there, as in your laptops and workstations and stuff. There might be a wireless zone, and then you'll have potentially a server one. You may have another one for more sensitive workloads, things like that. They're typically separated on what they call virtual LANs or VLANs, and then there's usually some sort of access controls between them, so that they're sort of firewalled off, or there's at least router rules to prevent traffic from going between those zones without so following those rules. And so a couple key things talking about firewalls. There is a diagram coming up, but you'll usually have network firewalls or host-based firewalls. So network firewalls are, as you can imagine, sitting in those network segments between those networks. So between the internet and the outside world, between the DMZ and the sort of internal facing systems, or you can have host-based, which is on the actual systems themselves. Generally, you have both. And then you've got, and that's talking about the placement. So is it edge? Is it internal? Is it sitting between servers? Is it sitting between Wi-Fi? But yeah, you have those segments and you have those rules. And one thing that I think many organizations still need to do, I know a lot of them have, but many of them haven't, is to deny egress traffic. So deny outbound traffic from the workstations and systems internally to the internet unless it's necessary, or limit it. So, that's something else, especially things like DNS traffic. They should be limited to only servers that fulfill DNS requests. So typically that'll be something like a dedicated DNS server or an internal Active Directory server or something like that if you've got one. And I'm not going to talk about zero trust this second because there's a bit more detail on this. So I'll skip that and we'll come back to it. And then you've got things like intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems. Now, what about remote networking? So this is where we have concepts like zero trust, and we have sort of private access solutions that are starting to come into play, because one of the things that happened obviously when sort of COVID came through, was folks suddenly had to work remotely because, especially if you're in Victoria, you have choice. And there was a bit of concern because now you're outside the bounds of the corporate firewall, which we'll talk about in a minute when we talk about zero trust. But so there are some concerns around that, and concepts like zero trust will help to deal with that. But as I said, in addition to that, you've got some other sort of solutions that help to limit risk there. The same slide twice. Anyway, so zero trust. Here we go. Told you there's a zero trust slide. So zero trust focuses. So zero trust. So traditional networks are focused on those perimeter protections, as I sort of mentioned before. And anything within the perimeter is implicitly trusted. So if I look at this diagram here, and sorry, it's a bit of a crude diagram, but on the left here, you've got the internet, the cloud, so that very untrusted space. You got a firewall, you've got the sort of DMZ network zone sitting behind that firewall. Then you have another firewall, and then you've got your more trusted infrastructure and systems. So you've got your client VLAN or your client zone, you've got your server one. Now that red computer is meant to be like your bad computer. So this is the one that's got like malware or threat actor on it or whatnot. But if you look at this, the clear problem here is that because this system is within that zone, it will be trusted by everything else that's in there. So that's how threat actors will move laterally. They'll infect a machine, and then they'll start moving around. And so that is one of the big issues with the sort of traditional network security model, is that movement and that lateral movement ability. And so this is where something like zero trust comes in, where no subject is trusted by default. So no application, no user or device is trusted, and that trust is reassessed and verified every time that a subject requests access. Sorry, that happens every now and then. Maybe because I'm like a mushroom, I'm seeing in the dark. Access to that new resource. And so, a little bit different. So as you see here, those connections are made with this kind of zero trust exchange, or this, sort of packet forwarding sort of service that, applies rules, does that assessment, and then forwards those requests to the various other internal or external resources. And this is different from something like, and I haven't got a slide on this, but like microsegmentation, because you may have heard of microsegmentation too, but that is more, to be honest, that's probably more closely related to this, but this is considered more macro segmentation, as in broad segmentation. And you've got, these zones, network zones, where in micro, each one of the devices or applications is in its own network segment. So that's where that's slightly different. Obviously benefits to that too. So yeah. Right, now where was I? System hardening. I'm not going to talk too much on this because we spoke about this last week. But yeah, when operating systems are deployed, and it's not just operating systems, it's also applications. There's potential in insecure states and configurations that could be exploited, and so there's some guidelines on that. So I don't think we need to talk about that one. But you know what I might do? I might pause for a second because I see that some questions have popped up, and then I'll keep going because there's no, those gray slides that kind of tell you there's the next section. There really isn't any more of those. It's just more content. So let's do that.
All right. I've got a preference to know some of these. So we've got a question about, in the age of AI, can we still trust a password because of its length or complexity, which I think you addressed somewhat, but also maybe let's tie that in with this question asking, pass keys are gaining in popularity. What are your thoughts? And perhaps define exactly what pass keys are for everyone.
Okay. So when we think about AI, I mean, that's a very topical, I guess, area. And, I think one of the things that, I've had lots of questions about AI. And, there is that, I guess, the thought process that, there's at least some quite, guardrails in there to prevent that sort of misuse. But I think that, can we trust a password because of its length or complexity? I think that if we talk about, it depends on what we're looking at. I think the short answer is yes. I think we can, on the basis that it is not something that's being, recycled, or that you're using things that are kind of known to you. Like if it is pure, like if we talk about a passphrase that is purely completely random, I feel like that's going to still have some level of durability, even against AI. Obviously, I would also then completely highly recommend the use of an additional factor like MFA, because it's not even that. Like we talk about compute power and that increase in compute power. There's always going to be things that are pushing against our ability to have strong authentication mechanisms. So I think it's that defense and depth thing, right? So it's about doing multiple things. I think, I don't know if that answers the question, without being a complete expert on AI and whether it could do that. I think if you were asked AI to go and find all the passwords you could find on me, that would definitely be an issue. I know that I've had some, websites that I've accessed in the past that have been breached, and those passwords have popped up in password dumps. Like LinkedIn, for example. I've got a copy of that database, and at one point, and I looked at it, I'm like, oh yeah, that was my password. It's not my passwords now, because I use a password manager with random passwords. But yeah, I think if we look at something like ChatGPT, it's knowledge currently is, unless there's been an update, is sort of dated. So yeah, I think there's still some merit to using long and complex passwords or passphrases. It's more so if that password's been disclosed previously, I think you're going to start running into problems. So pass keys, are you talking about like the hardware ones?
I'm not sure what this person is asking about, really.
Let me get some clarification on that. Yeah, I don't know if we could, how do we get clarification in answers?
Okay. Should we maybe skip this question and move on to what your opinion is on allowing biometrics on user devices, i.e. do you think fingerprint or Face ID is secure, or how secure?
So I think it depends on the type of device. And so and I use the example of like Apple. I think it's probably well known and well documented that the sort of the Apple Face ID and the Touch ID, at least now, I think initially there were definitely some teething issues, but I think there is definitely security in that, arguably probably more than a 4-digit PIN. I think, when I think about the banks, for example, I think the banks have accepted that as a strong control. I don't know if anyone's, I was certainly shocked. I went and bought something that I thought would definitely ask for my PIN using my Apple Pay, and it was just like, yeah, cool. I was like, really? Like what? At which point, it's kind of like, okay, well, it's valid. I've used that biometric factor to, to unlock my device, and then I've used that to unlock that card. Therefore, me going and spending, a couple of $1,000s using a card is okay. Where it used to be, you find a card, you tap it, $100, $101, and require a PIN. So I think, it depends on it depends on what it is. So I think there's going to be some that are better than others. I think, as I said, something like an Apple device or an Android device probably have more sophisticated and better biometric technologies that are able to properly validate, where there's going to be some that are probably not that great. So it's going to get back to my thing saying you need to do a risk assessment of that particular thing before deciding whether to accept it and to use it.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions in the Q&A that you particularly want to answer currently? Or otherwise, feel free to just move on to the next section.
Yeah, look, I'm just looking at time as well because we've only got about half an hour and I've still got another 10 slides. So let's keep going.
Let's keep going then.
Yeah. Okay. So vulnerability management. This is a big one. And I feel like, this is one of the joys of being around for a little while. You kind of see when things gain popularity, and usually not for the right reasons, not for good reasons anyway. So vulnerability management, this describes, or if you talk ISO technical vulnerability management, describes the whole, I guess, identifying and prioritizing and remediating vulnerabilities. And so vulnerabilities can exist in multiple forms. It could be a, application or an operating system. And, think about AC Essential 8, right? They've got 2 controls just on patching, one on applications and operating systems. It could be that, or it could be, if your organization develops software, it could be a software bug that's in your own sort of product. And so this is where, that needs to be, I guess, addressed. And so the first thing would be to be able to have a solid strategy around this. When you remember when things gain popularity, I don't know if anyone can guess when I'm talking about, but I'll save everyone the guessing. It was 2017. I feel like this suddenly became really important. So 2017, if anyone recalls MS 17-010, it was a vulnerability in Microsoft Windows that was then exploited by, some pretty aggressive malware that then ransomware systems. So I'm talking about WannaCry. And the reason why I'm saying that this was, I feel like a pivotal moment, is because that patch was missing in so many places and so many organizations, small and large, fell victim to this vulnerability. So this vulnerability, or this sort of bug that was in the Microsoft SMB, server message block sort of process, was able to be exploited. So something, a piece of software or threat actor was able to manipulate that that bug and use it to gain access to systems and to spread. Even if this has been an issue since like forever. I remember, in my classes when we talk about the history of sort of cyber warfare, even though this isn't specifically cyber warfare, we talk about the Morris worm back in the 80s, where Robert Morris developed a worm that was designed to, quote, identify vulnerabilities in systems, and it basically spread like wildfire because obviously all these systems were vulnerable, and that could even be like bad configuration. It's not necessarily a bug; it could just be really, really horrible passwords. So using like password, there's a whole bunch of reasons but a vulnerability is any weakness, right? But yeah, this worm spread, and the worm back in the 80s spread and resulted in this sort of denial of service scenario where systems basically went offline. And this fellow was I think from memory, the first person to be prosecuted under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in the US. So that was pretty significant. But hey, didn't learn our lessons then, and vulnerability still existed. And I think, as I said, in 2017 was a bit of a switch. And I remember at that time, making sure that perhaps technical vulnerability management strategies were solid for where I was currently at. And so here we talk about having a documented strategy that includes, the process around identifying those vulnerabilities, doing that assessment and then timing and application of patches. And I'm going to go back to this senior leadership thing. I found it was very important to make sure that, aside from the fact that this was a documented policy and supporting sort of, you know, standards and processes, but that senior leadership had actually, you know, bought in and endorsed this strategy. And the reason I say that is because when I was going through this, you know, a few years ago, one of the challenges was that, you know, when you apply patches to a system, whether they be a security patch, well, these were security patches. I mean, forget feature patches, but just you know, updates in general. When you apply them, there's often a requirement to reboot, and there's often downtime, and there's often also risk that the system might not come back up. And so it's not unheard of to get pushback. Oh, can we just push those patches out a week? Can we push them out another week? Can we push them out another week? And then before you know it, you've got a massive issue on your hands. So having senior management say, yep, no, we are happy that this is how it's going to be, and to support that is really, really important. You know, we talk about prioritizing patches. So, you know, CVSS scoring, which is the Common Vulnerability Security Scoring method. It's a score from 1 to 10. And when you see a, so if you go to the CVSS website, you can see like vulnerabilities, and they'll have a score 1 to 10. And what that sort of, I guess, what that describes is the sort of, I guess, I don't know the exact definition here, but the likelihood that that threat will be exploited in the wild, really. So, and the sort of impact of that threat. And so it's important to consider that as well, where, you know, just because it's a 10, is it a 10 to you? And I say that because you also, you know, need to consider what other controls are in place that might mitigate that vulnerability to some degree. So, you know, it's really important that that thought process is put into play as well. Likewise, if the CVSS score is like a 5, does that mean it's unimportant or less important? Maybe not. If that's something that would be a critical issue, would it be exploited, or it has a higher likelihood of being exploited in your environment? So there is that. And then finally, there's the piece around timing. And so, you know, you need to kind of, and as I said, part of the buy-in thing, how quickly these patches need to get rolled out. You know, the ACSC from memory says like an extreme risk. So, you know, let's say it's a patch that's being actively exploited and it could cause, you know, all sorts of severe damage, should be applied within 48 hours. If it's a high, within 7 days. If it's a medium, within 14 days, and lows, something like that, isn't it? Medium, high, low, no, extreme, high, medium, low, something like that. Anyway, but you know, 48 hours can be troublesome. I know that 48 hours can be troublesome because that doesn't give you much time to test your patch and to make sure that it's not going to break anything. You know, there was even times where we, you know, had 7 days to test a patch and tested fine, and then rolled it out, and like weird things happened. There was one, I don't know if anyone experienced this, but a few years ago, there was a Windows patch that just made all the icons disappear. It's like really annoying. You could bring them back, but then they just like disappear again. So, you know, that the patching cycle, while urgent, you know, can also create your own internal incidents, although probably better than a data breach. So that goes back to that whole risk type stuff, right? So, yeah, vulnerability management. And then we go into endpoint protection. So this is securing, the practice of securing endpoints, or entry points, but in this case, we're going to talk about endpoints. So desktops, laptops, mobiles, from being exploited by, you know, sort of threat actors. And here, you know, the sort of traditional antivirus, anti-malware is what, you know, has always kind of been the thing, right? So, you know, going back into the sort of, yeah, almost 80s, like early 90s maybe, you know, install antivirus, install anti-malware. And so, you know, your old sort of, you know, McAfee's and your Symantec's and your CA's, Trend Micros and all that sort of stuff. I mean, some of those vendors still around, some not. You know, that was, you know, where that's what everyone just used to do. And then I think one of the issues with this is a lot of that would rely on signature-based detection. So, this piece of this virus has the signatures that, would confirm that it was a virus, and then that system would pick it up. And these platforms would either detect when a file was either being scanned, because you would run a file scan, or when it was being executed. And so obviously there's some drawbacks on here. There's some drawbacks that if the signature changes, that the platform can't detect it. If it's a quote we call a 0 day, so if it's something that's like brand new and there's not a signature out for it, it won't detect it. Same thing with patching, right? And I should have mentioned there's also the sort of 0 day concept around vulnerabilities, where a vulnerability has just been found and there's no update for it, no patch. And then also, sorry, lost my train of thought. But that would mean that things would go undetected and then would be free to kind of wreak havoc. And so this is where something like application control, formerly application whitelisting, once again one of the ACSE essential 8 controls, the first one, which would prevent the execution of an executable. And by an executable, it's not just an exe as an exe file. It could be a script, so it could be a VBS, batch file, a jar file. It could be an extension. So if anyone's got like Chrome extensions, things like app control, depending on the platform, I'm pretty sure most of them could do this, can actually prevent the execution of all those other things. So so that way, if someone decides to write a VB script or a whatever and get it to download malware or to run some sort of function, if it's not approved, it won't run. And so that's why that's a really good control, because it prevents running versus trying to detect. It just goes, well, I don't trust you, so you can't go. And then in addition to that, you've got things like endpoint protection. So endpoint detection and response, EDR. And so that is about detecting anomalies and strange behaviors and strange processes on a machine. There's this, you probably heard the concept of like off the land attacks, which is where threat actors are now, rather than uploading like malware, because systems often will detect and block those, they're utilizing things like PowerShell and PSExec and those sort of native tools that are available in the operating system, which are approved to run to conduct their attack. And so something like an EDR solution would say, okay, there's some weird stuff going on here. Like there's some weird PowerShell commands that are running that shouldn't be running on this machine, and it would alert to the fact that that's happened. So that's some of the endpoint protection stuff, which is different from XDR. I think someone asked about XDR, I don't know, a week or two ago. And so EDR and XDR are not the same. It is extended detection and response. And all that really talks about is bringing multiple, what's typically multiple siloed sources together. So if you think about, endpoint detection and response talks about the endpoint, but then you've got, emails, and you've got, email servers, and you've got, cloud and things like that, which are also collecting, effectively telemetry. And by consolidating that all and having that single pane of glass view, consulting buzzword, that's considered XDR. So yeah, so that's where that term comes from. So not quite the same. All right. Data protection. I think this is probably the last bulky bit. I'm just going to pause here before we get into data protection, because there's quite a bit here. I'm going to answer a few of these questions. Can you explain denying egress traffic? So if I think back, way back, we've always, when I say we've always, firewalls have, internet-facing firewalls have typically, unless they're configured quite poorly, blocked inbound traffic, unless something was explicitly permitted. So for example, if I was on the internet and I wanted to access a web server that was, in my corporate environment, then I would open port, well, 80 or 443, right? So 80 for HTTP or 443 for TLS. So I'm poking a hole in there. so that I can access a particular service. Or if I wanted to like remote desktop to something, I would open TCP 3389. I would definitely make sure that I had multi-factor on it. I was going to do that. But what I'm getting at is that you have this default deny. So everything that's inbound by default is blocked, and then you're allowing certain things. Well, networks were always sort of configured to not have that go the other way. So if you're on the trusted side of the network, so the LAN side, so to speak, you could get to anything on the internet. So there was no blockage. You could go to any port on any server that was listening and it would be fine. And so what happens is, or what has happened a lot is, if there's a piece of like, malicious software or even a threat actor that is within the environment, they can now just send data to wherever. So from a data exfiltration perspective, this is a big issue because there's nothing that's really stopping them, because the firewall is saying, oh, you want to get out? Yeah, cool. Likewise, where some organizations had slightly more advanced sort of capabilities, they were using like protocols that weren't intended to be used for that purpose. For example, DNS was a big one. You would often see DNS traffic that was going out that wasn't actually DNS traffic. It just happened to be over UDP 53. But because it's UDP 53, firewalls just go, oh, DNS, and you look at it and go, oh yeah, it's DNS. And so when I talk about denying egress traffic, what I'm saying is that you now don't allow by default traffic going in either direction, and you now select what goes out. And so, for example, with DNS, you would only allow DNS to go out from a DNS server that is, meant to be there for resolving requests. So in an Active Directory example, Active Directory domain services has DNS as usually as a service that's running on it. And each of the clients would go and talk to the DNS server, and then they would then the Active Directory server could send out a DNS request to an internet site, internet DNS service like Cloudflare or whatever. So by that logic, you only need to allow that server DNS access. Likewise, why would you require the majority of people to be able to remote desktop out from their client workstations? So in that situation, you would just block that. So that's kind of what that's getting at, right? So you're only allowing the sort of bare minimum in both directions, which, because the other thing that happens is, there's that sort of command and control type attacks that happened, and those things go over those channels and those sort of weird ports as well. So that's really what the intent of that is. Vulnerability scanners for application source code and threat modeling reports, and a lot of things which software engineers are not an expert of. On security teams, they do not know how to code. So that, yeah, okay. That's a very long question. Elevation of privilege on this complex software requirement. And DOS seems networking side. Should security be addressed by different teams? No. Well, so then there needs to be oversight on the sort of vulnerability management, I think, by some more sort of central function that does that. But developers kind of need to resolve their, if I'm reading this properly, they're going to need to resolve the sort of vulnerabilities in their source code. I mean, there are tools that can help with that. So there are tools like Sneak that are out there that can, and I know there's other ones that can, scan source code, look for vulnerable libraries, look for like kind of, bad coding, I guess, and sort of identify those vulnerabilities that can then be prioritized. And I think generally the developers need to resolve that, but there needs to be some sort of oversight. It needs to be built into that vulnerability management program separately. I guess that's how I've typically seen it done. Because you're right. I mean, they're probably not experts in that area, but it's more about, putting those in as, things to fix as bugs effectively. The other thing is around doing appropriate training. So, secure code training. If you look at something like the OWASP standard, and I'm talking just about the OWASP top 10, so WASP, but there's some guidance around secure development lifecycle, and that provides some good guidance on how to deal with some of that secure development stuff. Whoa, I don't know where those questions went. They still vanished.
It's a timing thing.
Oh, that's a hint. Okay. No worries. Um, so data protection. So this is a big one, and I think it's probably no surprise to anybody that this is a big one. So we have, and as I mentioned before, we in Australia we have Privacy Act. In the EU we have GDPR. In Australia we're currently going through privacy reforms, and there's going to be some more, potentially some more stringent requirements around the protection of personal information. Now that's talking about PI and sensitive PI, but then there's also just the general protection of confidential business information that organizations have for intellectual property, competitive advantage, all that sort of stuff, right? And so this is where data protection is a really important piece that I feel personally has needed more attention for quite some time. And once again, it takes a turning point for this stuff to become like really, really important. We could probably guess what that is. So the first piece is classification. I'm going to step through each of these individually. So what is data classification? So data classification is effectively classifying or putting an attribute to a piece of information based on its sensitivity. And so when we talk about sensitivity, and I've used 3 examples here. So the Australian government and the US government have classification schemes, we call them, and I think every organization needs to adopt some level of classification scheme. It doesn't need to be super complicated, and that's what I'm going to say. What is an example over here? I mean, obviously the governments have, because if you don't do this, then you don't know the value of the information. And what should be happening is you should be applying controls that reflect the sensitivity of the information. So, for example, and if I go straight to the right to the corporate example, if it's public information, do you need to spend millions of dollars to protect it? I think the answer is probably no. So the first thing is identifying what your classification scheme is, and I'll get into discovery in a minute. But sort of understanding what the different types of sensitive data are. Usually I'll have some of an idea. This may coincide with some of the discovery stuff, but as I said, the government will have protected, secret, top secret. With the government bodies, that there is levels of clearance that are needed to access these sorts of things. But ultimately, secret, top secret, sorry, being national security threats and those sorts of things. As in, if that got out, that would be a national security disaster. Versus protected, which is obviously very, very sensitive, and not for public consumption, but not obviously as sensitive. If I skip over to the right, and I've used the example because this isn't prescriptive. I mean, these are common classifications that are used by corporates, but there could be less of them, there could be more of them, there could be others. So public usually would be, so public's usually one. So that's anything that, like marketing material and stuff like that, that's for public consumption. And, it doesn't require a huge amount of protections. Internal, things like internal procedures and stuff like that. And then you get into like the confidential and restricted stuff. So personal information might be in here, trade secrets, financial records, all that sort of stuff is going to be up in this sort of confidential, restricted space. And so on top of this, the next thing is, how do you know which piece of data belongs to sort of which sort of classification? And this is where things like labeling come into play, right? So, Microsoft have Azure labels, or they call them, part of their information protection stuff. There are third-party tools out there, like I don't know what's going on with Titus and Bolden James. I think they had some like acquisition stuff happen a couple of years ago. I think they're one and the same now. But providing that labeling, so being able to label data. So you've probably seen, if you've got a email from a government body, you've probably seen like official, or official sensitive in Australia, or unclassified. You see stuff like that. That's labeling. Labeling doesn't necessarily need to be generally, and once again, comes down to a business decision, but it doesn't need to be like at an individual document level. Sometimes an entire database or repository can have a classification more broadly, and then you just know that anything within there is classified as, e.g., confidential. So yeah, that's one thing I had to wrangle my head around for a bit early on when I was kind of learning this stuff. Once you've done that and you know your sort of classification schemes and you've got your labeling sorted out, you need to know what information you actually have. And so this is where, where is your data? This is, when we talk about the sort of asset and inventory, that's this piece. So where is your data? So you need to discover it because it's probably everywhere. And so doing that discovery and then applying those labels to it is the next sort of step. Having some sort of data cataloging would be, obviously beneficial to help keep track of this stuff. But yeah, that would be the next thing. Do the data discovery and then apply those labels. So now you know what you have and how sensitive it is. And obviously, once again, very important for determining what controls that you put into place. Roles. Sorry, I'm starting a little bit faster because I know we are kind of running a bit short on time. So data roles. So, these are probably the common data roles that I see. So who owns the data? Who is ultimately the owner? So that owner is the person that's going to be responsible for, I'm going to say yes, owning it, but for making sure that, it's looked after, making sure that, retention periods are complied with, making sure that it is, that the other roles are kind of doing their job. You got data stewards. Data stewards are typically responsible for the quality of data. So they're the ones that will sit there and go, okay, yeah. And we talked about integrity before. So that would be a data steward, making sure that there's integrity and quality within the data. The custodians are the ones that are responsible for almost the security and custodianship of that data. So that's typically your information security team. So an information security person isn't generally going to be a data owner or steward. They're probably more likely to be a custodian. So making sure that the controls are in place to protect that information. And then finally, your data users, and I think it's pretty obvious who your data users are. They're the people that consume the data and use it and access it on a day-to-day basis. Sorry, something a little bit faster because so talking about how you protect data at rest. And so encryption. So protecting your data at rest is generally done with encryption. So yes, you've got the access controls and stuff like that, and that would protect being able to kind of log into a system. But let's say hypothetically, you go and dispose of a system and you forget to like erase it. This is where you're going to have to probably rely on an encryption control. So full disk, or it's stolen. Talking before about something being stolen or lost, like a laptop. So full disk encryption is available on Windows, so BitLocker, macOS, FileVault, Linux. These just called full disk encryption. It's also on mobile devices, so your iPhones and so forth have full disk encryption available. But also, and so what that does is that encrypts the entire disk. It's generally transparent to the user, so you may have to put in a PIN or something when you boot, or you would definitely have to log in. But you interacting with that system once you're authenticated, like it's not even there. Specific platforms also have encryption, for example, SQL Server. So SQL Server, which is Microsoft's database engine, has TDE, so transparent data encryption, which is very much like full disk encryption, as in it's transparent to the user. So that the backend database file itself is encrypted. And if someone took that, well, it's encrypted. But as a person that's going in and just looking at it through the SQL browser, so SQL Management Studio, for example, it looks no different. Always encrypted is where within those, and so sorry, SQL is like a structured data, so it's like tables with for anyone that's not familiar with rows and columns and records. Always encrypted is where the record within a column is actually encrypted and stored that way, and so you need to do an extra sort of, and that's an extra step to decrypt it, and that's usually done on the application side. So the application that's accessing it would access keys, talk about keys down the bottom, to then decrypt that. But if an administrator went in there and went to look at that data, they wouldn't be able to read it. It would just be garbage. And then you've got column-based encryption, which is similar, except it is readable by an admin. So while it is encrypted in there, it's that one layer down. Whereas always encrypted, I find to be the most secure one, because it's the application that's accessing the data that needs to do that. But in any case, all three of those will help protect data at rest to some degree, depending on what your requirements are. And then using something like key management, which is especially useful, there's a hint here, when disposing of data stored in the cloud. Because when it's in the cloud, deleting your account or shutting down the VM or the resource doesn't properly dispose of it. There's still a risk that someone could get it back. And so crypto shredding, which is where you encrypt the data on the cloud using your own keys, and then you pull those keys. And that can happen with anything. If you have encryption key management and you pull the key, that you can no longer access that information. It's lost. Well, it's got to back up somewhere. But yeah, that's the most effective way to delete cloud stuff. So couple more and then we'll go to questions and close out, I guess. So protection data in transit, this one's pretty straightforward. So TLS 1.2, 1.3, SSL, TLS 1.0, 1.1, which are the previous versions. So TLS, think HTTPS in a browser. So that's that encryption in transit. They have vulnerabilities. So, but yeah, there's other protection mechanisms as well. You can encrypt a file before sending it. Some applications like Microsoft 365 LA to send a link to then have someone go and collect the file, even though that's all encrypted over TLS anyway, but it will just add that additional layer of protection. And then, sorry, that was it on that. And then we've got retention and disposal. So yeah, I know I think I saw the word Optus pop up in here a little bit, but whoops. But only keep the data that you need. And so once again, this is kind of, up to data owners to enforce this, but having set retention schedules that meet organization, regulatory, and legislative requirements. And the reason I say that, and we always point back to those as well. For example, in Australia, for Fair Work Act requires that we keep records for, I think it's like 7 years at a minimum. Doesn't have a maximum period, not yet. But obviously there's some privacy reform changes that will probably set maximum period specification requirements, not being explicit to say you will only keep it for this long, but at least that you've got it clear. And then you've got other things like, the Privacy Act, which says that you will only keep personal information for a legitimate purpose. Same with tax file numbers, you'll only keep tax file numbers for a legitimate tax purpose. And so, it's clear that this stuff needs to be removed. And then have a clear disposal process that's been defined and is undertaken. And so when I say clear disposal process, as I said, whether that be crypto shredding, whether that be having a third party that destroys stuff for you and you get a destruction certificate, whether that be booting up with DBAN, the disk and writing zeros and ones over it, or whether you have something like there's like records management systems that will help enforce those retention periods. So we're talking about, retention of data in databases and unstructured data sources, as well as, disposal of equipment. So, yeah, that's the retention and disposal stuff. And finally, logging and auditing. So we talked a little bit about this. I think I saw some stuff fly past in the chat. We talked about this in the accounting part, but logging is important. It's important to centralize and protect logs. I've been involved in incident response engagements where the threat actor has gone in, done something. There's been no centralized logging. They've just relied on a Windows event viewer, and the threat actor went in and said, well, I've been here from 10 to 12. So and obviously they escalated their rights to administrator rights, and they just went in and just deleted that block. So, it's really important to do that. And especially with multiple log sources from multiple systems to kind of correlate and get a full picture, logging is a critical component of doing that. And that was it. Look at that. See, 8:29.
Fantastic work, George. Thank you very much. Just a note for everybody that has questions that we did have to dismiss just for time reasons. Once again, we really encourage everybody to engage with the forums that are at learn.itmasters.edu.au. You can engage with your fellow students and with George on there for some of those more detailed questions, more specifics. We've got 3 remaining questions in the Q&A currently, as the Q&A has been closed. George, would you like to have a go at any or all of those?
So the first one I'm not going to answer because next week we're going to talk about penetration testing and ethical hacking and all that sort of stuff. And I think that would be a really good question for next week. So I know they were anonymous, but if they could ask that same question next week, that would be awesome. I do have some opinions on that, but I want to cover that off next week if we can. The second question is interesting in terms of, is there a best software that we can use to get rid of ransomware? I mean, there are different variants and strains of ransomware. That I don't know if there's any specific software that would do that. I don't know if anybody else in the chat has any advice here. But yeah, I feel like that's a bit of a hard question to ask, because it's very sort of circumstantial in terms of what the circumstances are and what's there. This one though, should a public classification be a controlled label in terms of user access to it? Yeah, so I think that's a really good question, and I was trying to think of like, what does that mean? But now I understand what you mean. Just kind of ticked over in the head there, because it is not uncommon, and I've seen this many times, for folks to pick the wrong classification. Or they might pick that classification because they think it's going to, not to suggest that, folks are malicious, but, maybe it'll prevent any triggers or things like that. So in terms of that, it depends on risk again, like what type of information do you have? I typically see organizations do default to internal or higher, or typically internal. I think it would be, depending once again on what type of information you have, it probably would be good advice to consider at least providing some justification. And you can do that in, for example, the Microsoft labeling. You could say, well, if you change it, you have to justify. And then typically if you do that, people will not do it unless it's like a legitimate reason to move to change the classification. So there is that option. So I think that is good advice, that if you want to do that, you want to downgrade a label, that there needs to be some check or measure that doesn't necessarily prevent it, but it makes someone sit there and think, should I be doing this? So yeah, I hope that answers the question for you.
Thank you very much. And just a reminder that the Q&As are now closed. So this is going to be the end of our session for this evening. Thanks everybody for all of your questions, all of your input into the chat as well. It's always great. And just a reminder that all of these materials, from the slides to the recordings, as well as the forums where you can continue asking and answering further questions, are available at learn.itmasters.edu.au. So thanks very much, George, and thank you as always to Kit for working very hard in the background of everything. Apologies again for my slightly stuffy nose and whatnot, and inability to be on top of my game tonight, but hopefully I'll be all better next week, and hopefully nobody else gets ill this winter if you are in the Southern Hemisphere as well. Lots of vitamin C, everybody.
Good advice.
It's like
and we hope you feel better.
I think I was going to try and say that it's like a good cybersecurity program for your body to take vitamin C, but I regret saying that out loud and on a recording now. That was slightly embarrassing. Thanks everyone.
Vitamin C and zinc, I believe, but yes.
Yeah, vitamin C, D and zinc. Yep.
All right.
See you later.
Thanks everybody.
Next week, same time and place.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.